Scripture will be John chapter 21, beginning with verse number 1. Again, that's John chapter 21, beginning with verse 1. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. And on this wise showed he himself. There were together Simon Peter, and Thomas called Didymus, and Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, and two other of his disciples. Simon Peter saith unto them, I go a fishing. They say unto him, We also go with thee. They went forth and entered into a ship immediately, and that night they caught nothing. But when the morning was now come, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples knew not that it was Jesus. Then Jesus saith unto them, Children, have you any meat? They answered, No. And he said unto them, Cast the net on the right side of the ship, and you shall find. They cast therefore, and now they were not able to draw it, for the multitude of fishes. The subject this morning is a different outlook and a desired outcome. A different outlook and a desired outcome. Rarely will you go to the doctor and get a prescription for only one pill. Very, very rare to have a medical problem and one pill solves the problem. Usually the prescription will have multiple pills in the prescription. In that vein, we have a crisis within ourselves that we need to deal with. As opposed to giving you all of the medicine in one pill this morning, I open this up as a series and invite you to study with us over the next at least 2 more weeks as we uncover some things that can help us. So often in preaching, we give a lot of information and we hope that it will impact your life in a positive way. I want to give you less information today than I would in a normal sermon so that it has an opportunity to sink in. And like a prescription, there is an additional dosage that you must take. And so I invite you to be a part of this series of study, and we will give you a pill today and another dosage on next week if the Lord says the same. As we consider this passage, it is interesting that experienced fishermen had been fishing all night long. And when morning comes, there are no results, nothing to show for their labor and their toil. Experienced fishermen found that the night and the morning produced nothing favorable, though they had experience, though they worked hard, and certainly did their very best. And Jesus comes along and challenges them to reconsider what they had been doing. And as we read in verse number 6, a change in their strategy brought about such a blessing that they were not able to draw all of the fish in the net because it was a multitude of fish. Some would argue that this is a story about faith, about trusting God, about submitting to the directives of Jesus. And I would not argue against that. I would, however, offer that there are some very practical things in this passage that can help us to understand how to get some different outcomes in our lives. I want to ask you to look at this carefully and practically and apply some very practical applications to our lives. Again, the disciples had been fishing all night long. In our lives, the night is symbolic. It is not just a representation of time. It is not just a representation of a space or period of time where darkness looms. But night can be symbolic in that night does represent time, but it also represents our labors. It represents a period of uncertainty. You and I have nights in our lives, and it can be midnight in your life, even though it's in the middle of the day. The night represents a period in your life where you are trying to do something, and what you are trying is not working. The night can reference symbolically blood, sweat, and tears, a period in which you apply your experience and expertise, and yet the results are not favorable. The night speaks to a time in which we approach life and the pending problems of life, and despite our best efforts, we don't seem to be getting what we set out to get. What I am fascinated with in this passage is Jesus told them to do something that many of us need to do in order to get a desired result. There is a dirty word with a clean meaning. Jesus told them to change. In so many words, they had been doing something, they were fishing, and Jesus told them to change what they were doing so that they could get a different outcome. He did not say, keep fishing on this side of the boat, keep doing what you're doing. He called them to change. And change is a dirty word because it challenges us to step outside of our comfort zone. It challenges us to admit that what we've been doing has not been effective. Change conjures up emotions and feelings that we don't want to deal with. Change makes us face our insecurities. Change causes us to admit our faults and our failures. And change is a clean thought. It has a good intent. But for all practical purposes, people don't want to change. And instead of seeing the value in changing, people tend to argue their strategy is going to work someday and somehow. They keep seeing the ineffectiveness of what they're doing. They keep seeing the decline in their strategy, but they are not willing to change. When Jesus says to the disciples that you need to change, and I know some people say, well, Brother Gibbs, I don't see the word change in this text. The concept of change is there. When Jesus said to them that you need to cast your net on the right side of the ship, many people would argue, well, I like the left side of the ship. And when my daddy taught me how to fish, we always fish on the left side. And we've been fishing on the left side for 100 years now. When we think about changing, we become defensive to what we need to change, and we are offended by the change that needs to take place. But I want to ask you to look honestly and carefully at not only the scripture, but to take a practical assessment of ourselves. For the disciples, the experience on the ship and what they were doing did not bring about a desired result. And all night long they are fishing. All night long they are using their expertise and not getting the result they desire. In applying that to our lives, let me say compassionately and boldly at the same time that many of us are not happy with some things in our lives. Let's be honest about it, and let's recognize that some of us have some ineffective results in our lives. Let's just be Judgment Day honest about it. Some of us have some jacked up outcomes in our lives. We sometimes have relationships that are jacked up. We sometimes have jobs that we're just unhappy with. We are trying to get jobs and have not been able to secure a new job. Sometimes our children are making choices that are certainly displeasing to us. Sometimes our finances are jacked up, and you can bail us out of a financial problem and we get right back into it because we keep fishing on the left side of the ship. We keep governing our relationships on the left side of the ship. We keep seeking a job on the left side of the ship. We keep handling our children on the left side of the ship. Sometimes our health is not where we want it, but we still stay on the left side of the ship. Sometimes spiritually, we are not where we need to be, and we are unhappy in our relationship with God, but we stay on the left side of the ship. And until we see the value in change, until we make a practical change and move to the right side of the ship, our relationships are going to stay what they are. Our job unhappiness is going to remain. Our inability to get a job, our children, our finances, our health, our spirituality, whatever you can put in there and say, I'm not happy with what I'm getting. I've been laboring and toiling all night. I've had a long period of time, and I am just uncertain. I am not getting what I think I have the potential to get until I see the value in change, and until you see the value of change and moving from the left side of the ship to the right side of the ship, the outcomes and the results are going to be the same. In order to get a different outcome, you've got to have a different outlook. In order to get a different outcome, you've got to have different input. If you keep with the same input, you get the same outcome. Now, here is the problem with our input and our outlook is that we are comfortable in our dysfunction. Now, if you are comfortable in your dysfunction, stay in your dysfunction. But don't say that you are uncomfortable in dysfunction and you want a different outcome, but yet you are comfortable when it's convenient and you don't want to put forth the change that's needed so that you can get to a place of comfort and a better outcome. You have to determine, am I going to put forth the energy and the effort to move to the right side of the ship, or am I going to be comfortable in my dysfunction? Let me offer to you in this first part of this series a practical means of how to move to the right side of the ship. You have to change your attitude. That's our point. This is not a three-part sermon. This is one point that I want to sink in. We will deal with some other steps, some other dosages of this spiritual prescriptive medicine. But right now, we just want to deal with the idea that we need to change our attitude. Behavior does not change until attitude changes. When Jesus said, go to the right side of the ship, if they had had the attitude that I like the left side of the ship, I like to stay at the back of the ship or at the front of the ship, their behavior would never have changed. When we have dysfunction, here are three things that we do when we have dysfunction. Sometimes we, number one, we defend our dysfunction. We can have a jacked up marriage, jacked up kids, jacked up jobs, jacked up health, jacked up spirituality, jacked up finances. And instead of addressing it, we defend the dysfunction. We defend what is wrong, and we do that in a means of trying to minimize how embarrassed we are and the shame and guilt that others cause us to feel. And it's not necessarily what they are doing, it's the recognition of that dysfunction that makes us believe that they are shaming us and making us feel guilty, when in reality that shame and that guilt comes from within, because if we are honest with ourselves, we know better and we know dysfunction when we see it. So we, number one, defend our dysfunction. The second thing we do is we give a disclaimer for our dysfunction. See, if something's messed up, we know it's messed up. So we start to give a disclaimer when we have to address it with other people. We know something is not right, so before we tell the truth, we give a disclaimer so that we can wrap up the dysfunction in a less hurtful and harmful package. We give a disclaimer and say, well, I need to admit this, but let me offer this. Well, really the truth is we start to package the dysfunction in a disclaimer so that we can minimize the impact of the dysfunction when we have to admit the dysfunction to someone else. We, number one, defend it. Number two, we give a disclaimer. The third thing that we do with dysfunction is that we redesign the dysfunction. And what I mean by redesign it is that we cause ourselves to believe that it's really not what it is. So we paint a narrative, we write a narrative, we speak a narrative that redesigns it so that it doesn't look as bad as what it really is. We redesign it, we reshape it, we regroup it so that when we look at it, it's really not that bad. And we cover beneath the surface the dirt, the dysfunction, by either defending it, giving a disclaimer about it, or redesigning it so that we lessen the impact. Now, here's how this practically plays out. When I was a little boy and I had gym shoes, tennis shoes, whatever you want to call them, like every little boy, and my mother would tell us to put our gym shoes in the washer and clean them. But my brother and I discovered something that was what we thought a shortcut. We discovered shoe polish. And we would get a bottle of shoe polish and it would have a brush on the end. And when you would open up the shoe polish and turn it upside down and apply it to the shoe, all you had to do was squeeze the bottle a little and the polish would come out through the brush and you would stroke the brush along the shoe. And we discovered that the more you squeeze the bottle, the more polish would come out. And the more polish that would come out, the less dirt you saw on the shoes. And so we would keep putting that polish across the shoe so that the dirt did not surface. Now, Mother said, wash the shoes and get rid of the dirt. But the easier route was to just polish across the dirt, and the more polish you put on it, the less dirt you saw. In reality, that's what we do in our lives sometimes. Instead of addressing the dirt properly and appropriately cleaning the dirt, we simply put polish on it so that others can't see the dirt, because we just want others to think that we are polished when beneath the surface we are dirty and tainted to the core. Here's the problem I discovered with putting the polish on dirt. Number one, when you apply polish to dirt, for a minute the polish looks good and it conceals the dirt. But when you put polish on dirt, it does not stick right. It does not have the effect long term because the dirt does not allow the polish to stick to the surface. As a matter of fact, if you read shoe polish, if you read the label on the shoe polish, it will tell you to clean the surface first before you apply the polish. But in our hurriedness to go outside and ride our bikes and do whatever we wanted to do, we just hurried up and put some polish over it. But the polish does not stick when the surface is not clean. The second thing we discovered in the polish is that after a period of time, because it doesn't stick, the dirt begins to expose itself and you get to see what's under the surface, and you either have to finally clean the gym shoes, or you keep applying the polish. My question to you is, are you going to keep applying some polish and trying to fool people and make people believe that things are better in your life, or are you going to take the time to do the cleaning and get beneath the surface and deal with the stuff that needs to be dealt with? When we talk about changing our attitude, we try to sell to others what we would not buy from them. Let me say that again. And in defending our dysfunction, in giving disclaimers about our dysfunction, in trying to redesign our dysfunction, if we put some polish over our dysfunction, we are trying to sell that to other people. But if they were selling that to us, we wouldn't buy it. And we would say, I know better. I got more sense than that. Who do they think they are fooling? When we are trying to sell to others, do we not think we wouldn't buy that ourselves? Jesus says, move to the other side. This starts not with an action, but with an attitude. You have to have the attitude that I am going to bring about a change by first changing my attitude, my thinking. Many times we are too busy addressing how we feel instead of addressing how we think. We are caught up in our feelings that we're not addressing our thought process. Our marriage will not change. Our life as singles will not change. Our experiences on the job, our children, our finances, our health, our spirituality, none of that changes by addressing how you feel. You have to start with how you think. Think about how many times in our lives our attitude is our enemy. Sometimes it's our self-talk. It's the stories we tell ourselves and tell others. It's the narratives that we construct. And we rehearse those stories, those narratives, that self-talk. We rehearse it so much in our minds that we accept it as truth. We accept it as the standard. And we start to believe our own negative self-talk and our own narratives. We will excuse something. We formulate an excuse. We defend the dysfunction. We give a disclaimer for the dysfunction. We redesign our dysfunction. We polish our dysfunction. And we start to believe, or at least accept, those narratives. And so we are no longer operating from objectivity. We're no longer operating from sensibility. We're no longer operating from facts, from figures, from statistics, from research, from counsel, from information. We are only operating according to how we feel and how we have taught ourselves to think about how we feel. Here's what we have to recognize. In our lives, we have to identify toxic thinking. We have to identify negative thinking. We have to identify pessimistic thinking. We have to identify self-defeating thinking. And we have to identify finger-pointing thinking. I'm going to give you those again. Sometimes we have toxic thoughts. We think some things that those thoughts are not healthy to get a better outcome. So we have to stop thinking toxic thoughts. We have to stop thinking negative. Well, I don't know why I'm going to go to the right side of the ship. If it ain't no fish on the left side, ain't going to be no fish on the right side. We have to stop negative thinking. We have to stop pessimistic thinking. There are people, and I know some folk, and you know some folk, who can find a problem for every solution. There are people who can find a problem to every solution. They are pessimistic. They don't believe anything can work. If you offer solutions, they can tell you why every solution is going to fail. They will argue against anything that you believe or otherwise could prove to be successful because they can find the hole in it. They can find the problem. We have to not be pessimistic. Then we have to stop being self-defeating. Many times we don't believe in ourselves. It's because maybe we've been beat up by others. We've allowed a person in a relationship to beat us down and negatively affect our low self-esteem. We've allowed how we've been treated by employers or co-workers to shame us. We have allowed people who did not honor us, who did not respect us, who did not love us. If we're not careful, that plays into our self-esteem and our self-image, and we give other people too much power in how we assess ourselves. We have self-defeating thought processes because somebody did not love me enough to honor me. And what we do, based on how others treat us, we start to feel like, well, maybe that's who I am, or maybe that's what I deserve, or maybe that's all that I am worth. And we don't consciously say it, but we practically start to do that, and we lower our standards, and we allow anybody and anything in our lives because we have a self-defeating mindset. And then we do finger pointing. We blame everybody else for our unhappiness. And we find ourselves not applying the energy and effort to move to the right side of the ship. Because instead of going to the right side of the ship, I want to blame the other disciples for the problems on the left side of the ship. See, I can say, well, it's because of Peter that we didn't get any fish on the left side of the ship. It's because of Thomas. It's because of Nathaniel. It's because of the sons of Zebedee. It's because of the other disciples. Sometimes we are too busy blaming and pointing the finger at other people instead of saying, I am going to take responsibility to change my attitude, because fishing all night long on the left side of the ship has not gotten me fish. Maybe I need to take responsibility for changing. In marriage, when people come in for marriage counseling, it's always my marriage would be better if my spouse would act right. It's always I could be better as a single person if these men would respect a strong woman, or if these women wasn't after my money. It's always somebody else's fault. We blame the finger, we point the finger and blame others. I ain't happy on my job because my children are messed up, because my finances are messed up, because my health, my spirituality. We major in finger pointing, but we give people too much responsibility and too much control in our ability to otherwise be happy. This was the problem with Adam in Genesis 3:12. You all remember Adam, when interrogated by God, said, God, it's your fault and it's her fault. It's your fault because that's the woman you gave me. It's her fault because she gave me the forbidden fruit. Adam did not say, it's me, it's me, it's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. One of the descendants of Adam, as we all have descended from Adam, is a person by the name of Saul. I want you to notice in 1 Samuel chapter 15, this is when Saul loses his favor with God. And I want to tell you that sometimes, and I need to say this lovingly, but I need to say this boldly. Some of us are not living under the favor of God. And I know that that's not comforting, because you can turn on the television and you can listen to a mega preacher tell you this is your year and God is going to bless you and you are walking under the favor of God and God is going to give you a breakthrough. This is your year. I just believe it. The Spirit spoke to me today and you going to get an increase. Your borders are going to be increased. Your job is going to be in. This is your year. And you can watch a mega church with a mega crowd applaud and come out in a thunderous response because they like to hear that. But the truth of the matter is that some of us are not living under the favor of God. Now let me show you how to get God's favor and help us to see the value and changing our attitude. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, I want everybody to look here. I want you to notice Saul loses his favor. And I want to show you and make a contrast as to how you lose favor and how you can maintain or gain favor. In 1 Samuel chapter 15 and verse number 3, the Bible says, "Now go and smite Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have." I need you to notice this phrase, utterly destroy all that they have. Underline the word all. He does not say some. He does not say most. He does not say a great portion of it. He says destroy all that they have and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. Now, look at verse number 9. But Saul. In verse 3, God gave him a directive. In verse 9, but Saul and the people. Notice this, Saul and the people. I need you to notice this, Saul and the people. I need to say it one more again. Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and of the fatlings and the lambs and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them, but everything that was vile and refuse that they destroyed utterly. Now let's go to verse number 13, because Saul thinks he's done a good job. In verse number 13, "And Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said unto him, Blessed be thou of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord." Now in verse 3, kill everybody, kill everything. In verse 9, but Saul and the people. Verse 13, Saul gives a report to Samuel, and he says, I did a good job. I did what God wanted me to do. Look at verse number 14. "And Samuel said, What meaneth then this bleating of the sheep in mine ears, and the lowing of the oxen which I hear?" Now notice what Saul says in verse 15. "And Saul said, They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice unto the Lord thy God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed." Listen to verse 15 carefully. In Saul's report, He says, I did a good job. The people messed up. It was the people who spared. But verse 9 says, but Saul and the people spared. But in verse number 15, Saul says, they have brought them. He does not take ownership for himself. He blames it on the people. And then I told you, sometimes we try to redesign our dysfunction. We try to make it sound like it's not as bad. He says to sacrifice unto the Lord thy God. God told them to destroy everything. He tries to say, well, they didn't destroy everything, but we're going to redesign this. I'm going to give this disclaimer, and I'm going to defend this. I'm going to put some shoe polish on this. What was spared was to give a sacrifice to God. Yeah, we didn't exactly do what we're supposed to do, but guess what? We're going to sacrifice that to God. Drop down to verse 20. And Saul said unto Samuel, yea, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord, and have gone the way which the Lord sent me, and have brought Agag, the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. Again, Saul is trying to make himself look good. He's throwing the people under the bus. I used to tell my children, I don't want you to ever get in trouble. But when you get in trouble, if you have to get in trouble, always get in trouble by yourself. Because the first person that talks gets the deal. The person, when you're in trouble, your friends will sell you out quick, fast, and in a hurry. And Saul has sold the people out. He does not say, verse 9 says, me and the people. Saul says in verse number 15, they did this. And then when you get to verse 20, he is still pointing the finger and blaming them and promoting himself. Why? Because he's defending dysfunction. Why? Because he's putting a disclaimer on dysfunction. Why? Because he's redesigning the dysfunction. Why? Because he's putting shoe polish on dirty shoes. And verse number 21, but the people took of the spoil, sheep and oxen, the chief of the things which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice unto the Lord thy God in Gilgal. Saul loses his favor because he points the finger. He does not take responsibility. He throws the people under the bus. Now, I want you to turn over to 2 Samuel chapter 12. I want to show you how to maintain or how to regain some favor. Look at David here. David sleeps with Bathsheba. David is a part of a conspiracy he orchestrates to have Uriah set up to die in battle. David is in sin. David is guilty of adultery. David is guilty of murder. David is guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. And the charges can go on. But in 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse number 13, notice the difference between David and Saul when they had to give an account. The Bible says, and David said unto Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said unto David, the Lord also hath put away thy sin, thou shalt not die. See, Saul suffered the permanent consequences because he did not take ownership. He pointed the finger. David was spared, and in a matter of speaking, David's sins, from our perspective, were worse than Saul's. Saul spared life. David took life. Saul spared animals. David slept with a woman who was married to another man. I mean, how low down can you be? But David said, I have sinned. Saul defended his dysfunction. Saul made a disclaimer for his dysfunction. Saul redesigned his dysfunction. Saul put shoe polish on his dirty shoes. David said, I have sinned. Listen, as we move to close, you have to move to the other side of the ship. And you have to do this by starting with a change in attitude. If your marriage is messed up, or if your marriage has failed, don't blame your spouse. Say, I messed that up. I am responsible for that brokenness. If you're single and you're struggling, don't blame it on somebody who won't marry you, or somebody who won't treat you right, or somebody that's making you pay for what they've dealt with in other relationships. You need to say, I am responsible for this. I am responsible for my job. I am responsible for my health. I am responsible for my finances. I am responsible for my children. I am responsible for my spirituality. As long as we have toxic thinking, negative thinking, pessimistic thinking, self-defeating thinking, finger-pointing thinking, all we are doing is defending our dysfunctional outcomes. All we are doing is putting a disclaimer on our dysfunction. All we are doing is redesigning our dysfunction. All we are doing is putting shoe polish on dirty shoes. You and I can have better outcomes if we move to the right side of the ship. Don't stay on the left side of the ship and keep defending your strategy to be on the left side. Don't stay on the left side of the ship and say, I could catch some fish if everybody else wasn't on this side of the ship. Don't stay on the left side of the ship and throw other people under the bus, so to speak. Don't stay on the left side of the ship and be comfortable in dysfunction. Today, I want you to get a piece of paper and write down what is dysfunctional in your life. Don't be ashamed, don't be embarrassed to admit some dysfunction exists. There is not a person in this fellowship and worship experience that does not have or have not had some dysfunction somewhere. Stop worrying about projecting perfection and beauty to other people and be honest with yourself. Stop trying to get people to buy what you would not buy yourself. You are trying to sell to people something you would not buy. Stop addressing your feelings and start thinking different. If you've been on the left side of the ship, you have to change your attitude about being on that side of the ship and have an attitude that says, today the dysfunction stops. Today I can make a change in my attitude so that I can start catching some fish. I want you to write down what is dysfunctional in your life. You don't have to tell me. You don't have to share it with others. This is something between you and the Lord. This is cathartic. This is healthy. This is a part of a healing process. If you go to the doctor, you don't get healing until you admit what is wrong. God can't heal you if you're not willing to be honest with him and say, you know what, I'm in a dysfunctional period in my life. I have something dysfunctional in my life. I'm not going to blame my spouse. I'm not going to blame the fact that I don't have a spouse. I'm not going to blame my job. I'm not going to blame my children. I'm not going to blame anybody. I am taking ownership today, and I'm going to change my attitude so I move from the left side of the ship to the right side of the ship. I am going to do this with the spirit of David and admit when I am wrong. I am not going to defend dysfunction anymore. And you might need to write that down. I will no longer defend dysfunction. I will no longer put a disclaimer on my dysfunction. I will no longer redesign my dysfunction. I will no longer put shoe polish on my dirty shoes. Today, I change my attitude and I am going to get a different outcome, and I'm not going to defend staying on the left side of the ship. I'm going to have an attitude that I need to move to the right side of the ship. And I promise you that some things will begin to change in your life when you change your attitude. Again, I want to invite you to continue to be a part of this series as we study a different outlook and a desired outcome. Don't keep whining, crying, and complaining about what's wrong in your life, because people don't want to keep hearing your sad story when they've got a sad story of their own. Don't keep saying, I'm waiting on the Lord, when the Lord is waiting on you. Today, attitudes have to change so that a different outlook can receive a different outcome. May God bless you and may God keep you. If you desire the prayers of the church, if you desire to be a part of the family of God, if you need to give your life to God today, if you need to rededicate your life to God today, we extend the invitation, and as they used to say in days of old, the doors of the church are open as together we sing.